You can follow me on Twitter on John A. Matthews 2. Today, we're going to be talking about reimagining safety in Oregon. Though sometimes regarded as progressive, Oregon, like many states, has a racist history of policing. Portland is one of the whitest, largest cities in America, with only 6% of the population being Black. And at times, its elected leaders, sheriffs, and police have been members of the KKK or other white nationalist groups. While many people think of the Ku Klux Klan as a Southern phenomenon, it had a huge presence in Oregon in the early 20th century. Outside of Portland, white supremacist ideology is even more prevalent. According to an FBI report, white supremacists and militia groups maintain active ties to Oregon law enforcement. For years, activists, organizers, and progressive politicians have been pushing for reform and accountability. Representative Janelle Bynum is a member of the Oregon Legislature's People of Color Caucus. Her caucus has proposed several bills calling for comprehensive police reform and accountability for police violence. For many months, these proposals were stalled, but against the backdrop of uprisings this summer, the legislature passed a package of 6 criminal justice reform bills. These bills would ban the use of potentially fatal police force practices such as chokeholds and would limit the use of weapons such as tear gas and sonic weapons, known as long-range acoustic devices, or LRADs, which police have deployed against protesters. The bills would also make disciplinary records of officers more transparent and give oversight agencies more power to discipline officers for misconduct. Oregon Governor Kate Brown signed the bills into law in September. However, Oregon law enforcement has pushed back against the governor and the reforms of the legislature. Sheriffs from the 3 counties representing Portland rejected the governor's proposed plan for state and county law enforcement to monitor protests in Portland, citing, quote, lack of political support for public safety, unquote. Activists have complained that Portland law enforcement gives preferential treatment to right-wing counter-protesters who've targeted demonstrations for police accountability. Protests have been ongoing for more than 100 days in Portland. To discuss the efforts for police reform in Oregon, we're joined by Representative Janelle Bynum and Bobin Singh, the founding executive director of Oregon Justice Resource Center, who has been active in pushing for police reforms across Oregon. Representative Bynum, I'd like to start with you. I know you like challenging systems. What do you think will change in Oregon as a result of the package of police reform bills passed this summer? And how much of an impact do you expect these to have on curbing police misconduct?
Well, thank you. We have just scratched the surface on police reform, to be quite honest. And the more we dig, the deeper the hole, right? It just gets bigger and bigger, and we realize how deeply embedded these structural inefficiencies or predetermined outcomes are for, especially for people of color. So we've just scratched the surface. We did a lot to begin with. We moved about 8 bills, which is unprecedented, but we probably have room to move 20 to 30 more in the very near future just to make a dent in the system.
You speak of moving more bills. What else would you like to see in addition to what's been passed?
So to begin with, what we passed really talked about banning the use of chokeholds, and you mentioned some of this, looking at the use of force. We're trying to get more transparent on police misconduct, getting investigations handled much more quickly, producing databases of police misconduct. So when police are disciplined at their department, that would go into a public database. We are working on trying to eliminate people from even getting into the force who are sympathizers with white supremacy organized groups, or people who are currently in the system who are sympathizers. So those are just some of the things. I'll give you one more example. Identification in uniforms. I think it's to build public confidence, we have to know who we're talking to. And so to have these police officers not have identification or just have a number, it doesn't build public confidence, and it certainly doesn't create accountability. So that's the direction that we're going in, a really broad swath, comprehensive police reform that is really going to take years.
So I'd like to back up a little bit. You've been working on police reform since you took office in 2017. What were the barriers that you had to overcome to pass this reform package this summer, and how did your caucus accomplish that?
2 things. I would say maybe it was either apathy or a lack of connection to the concerns that especially people in the Black community had, but mostly I would say the broader Brown community and people who were allies and supporters. So that was one piece. And then the other piece I would say is police accountability butts up against this very interesting world of labor law. And so when you get really close to it, it's just like we're trying to work on doxing, where people's personal information is spread out on the internet in order to cause them some level of harm. As we start to look at that type of legislation, it bumps up against the First Amendment. So in police accountability type of work, what we bump up against is labor law, and people start to get very, very edgy when you start to push on what the rights and responsibilities of public servants are. So that's, I would say that has been one of the biggest more silent pieces of the resistance that we've had to encounter.
Can you talk a little bit more about that resistance and specifically the labor question, right? So what does that mean? Can you give an example of kind of one way in which that's manifested?
Yeah, so we just passed, I think it was Senate Bill 1604, which modified arbitration and modified the idea that their police unions had to bargain a discipline matrix so that we could determine the outcomes prior to something bad happening and people getting off with a slap on the wrist. Well, in Oregon, we have a very quiet way of being resistant in some cases. And so people wouldn't necessarily come out and say it in public, or they wouldn't come out and say it in the committee meeting, but they would work behind the scenes to either make sure that the bill never came up for discussion, or they would use arguments like this is a slippery slope. If you do this to police, it's going to do the same thing to firefighters. And now the argument is that teachers really worked hard to have arbitration agreements included in their contracts, and now you're touching arbitration. So teachers could be next. And where I push back is that if the outcomes aren't good for everybody, then that's a system that needs to be reformed. And I'm not interested, not about going after anybody for me. It's about building foundational justice and outcomes that work for the entire community. And if your particular policy is in the way of a healthy life for Black Americans, Black Oregonians, Brown Oregonians, then I have a problem with that. And we're going to bring that up at the table.
So I'd like to talk about that specific idea, like of your communities, the folks that you represent. How has the opposition to these reforms been felt within the communities you represent, and what can we expect in terms of backlash from opponents of reform going forward?
What's really been interesting, and I think it's a testament to being a leader for the moment, what I have really been surprised about is that the resistance to these bills has actually, in this moment, so meaning maybe from like June, July up until now, we actually, through a lot of negotiation, a lot of trust building, a lot of common interest building, have been able to get people to the table. So traditionally, people who would assume that, they would never be talked to by someone who's a progressive like me, the Fraternal Order of Police are at the table, the DAs are at the table, the chiefs and sheriffs are at the table, and the community is at the table. So I'm actually optimistic, and so optimistic that I think we're going to move more landmark legislation going forward. And that is because everybody benefits when we have a system that holds people accountable fairly.
So on the briefing, we cover a lot of issues, a lot of levels of government. When you talk about the
Mm.
table, what table is that? Can you talk a little bit just about what your specific role is, in Oregon, and where you fit in
Right.
all this?
So I am the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, and I am also the co-chair of the Joint Committee on Transparent Policing and Use of Force Reform. It's a mouthful. But that second committee right now is tasked with coming up with police reforms. And so, as we develop the bills, which will be heard in special sessions should the governor choose to call them, as we develop those bills, we bring people to the witness table to talk about the bills as they're proposed right now. And then the other part of the process is what we have in Oregon called a work group process. And it's basically different stakeholders, like your next guest, different stakeholders come to the table. So we'll have the district attorneys, we'll have the chiefs and sheriffs of police, we'll have people like the Innocence Project. We'll have people with different positions around a certain issue. So, our next issue, for instance, is like the Brady Bill and protections for police and protections for the community when it comes to a police officer who is deemed untrustworthy by the DA. So, we'll have all of those people around the table to kind of hash out the intricacies of a bill, and then what we'll do is send it for drafting and present it to the public for feedback. So it's kind of, they call it sausage making, I call it collaboration. And to me, this is really what is missing, I think, in American politics today, is a sense of statesmanship and a sense of everybody coming around the table to get the results that we desperately need. So that's the process here in Oregon. That's the process that I lead, and that is what is producing more legislation than Oregon has passed since before I was born.
Thanks so much, Janelle. Bob, and I'd like to turn to you and talk about, the results that you want to see. But to back up a little bit, and I'd like you to give us some background on how law enforcement has been structured in Oregon and how that structure has led to a level of violence that we've seen out there recently.
Certainly, and thanks for having me on. It's always, really great to be able to talk about these issues, with the appeal, and also alongside Representative Bynum, who's doing, great work through the BIPOC caucus here in Oregon. I think the conditions that exist here in Oregon are historical. I mean, this state, along with this country, was founded on white supremacy and sort of the ideology that drives white supremacy. And it was founded as an exclusion state. So in its constitution, when it was created, it prohibited Black people from living in this state. And throughout the late part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, what we saw was a lot of policies and practices that came into effect that basically, was targeted towards the populations that were starting to immigrate into the state, whether it was Asian, Mexican, or the Black population. And so we have this very strong history of sort of white supremacy. And as you mentioned, a really strong presence of the KKK in the early part of the 20th century. And this state has never reconciled with that history. There's a reason why the alt-right and neo-Nazi groups have chosen the Northwest and have a strong presence in the Northwest, and how that ideology has become, more in line or more in the political mainstream. And that's where we see sort of the law enforcement, the conflation of these far-right extreme elements and law enforcement and practices against, I think, minority populations and also protesters. So what we've seen and what we see around the country is research shows that law enforcement tends to think of this ideology more mainstream, more consistent with their own viewpoint. So these far-right groups come in, they co-opt these symbols of pro-law enforcement, use that as a way to sort of masquerade their violence and their sort of hate and bigotry. And we see law enforcement actually from many parts of the state or neighborhoods or towns that these individuals are coming from. So we see there is like a more of a political or philosophical alignment with these far-right groups. And I think what we have and what historically what we've had in law enforcement in Oregon and especially in Portland is very much a force that perceives itself as wanting to dominate the community and dominating communities of color. I don't think we have a Portland Police Bureau or a city that has been committed to thinking about civil rights and liberties in protective ways, or really engaging with racial justice issues, or really looking at demographics in Oregon, how that's changing, and how to create law enforcement and public safety systems that are more responsive to that diversity that's now been increasing here in Oregon. But the history of Oregon, the history of the Northwest, I mean, there's so many different events that have occurred here in Oregon in the Portland area that have intentionally pushed out communities of color, especially the Black community. And what we see is law enforcement either paralleling that effort or sustaining that effort or complicit in helping forward those sort of efforts.
So, we've seen and heard that protesters have encountered issues with both law enforcement and white supremacists, right, at different times in protests. Can you talk about how that's, in the last 100 days, how constitutional rights have been limited and what you've been seeing on the ground in terms of, protesters and their inability to, express their freedom of speech? And
yeah, I mean, I think it's been pretty eye-opening to see what's transpired over the past 100 days. I think, again, the only way to explain it is it really feels like the Portland Police Bureau has a mentality or a viewpoint or perspective in which they want to dominate protesters. Like, they don't like protesters. They don't like the messages that they're trying to articulate or stand for, which is a combination of both racial justice and pushback against law enforcement violence and brutality, and the culture of law enforcement that's existed here in Oregon. So what we've seen is, I think misuse of the laws in order to be able to justify violence against protesters. So we see Portland Police Bureau, declare unlawful assemblies or riots very quickly when left-leaning protesters are out there or BLM protesters are out there. And then based on that, they will engage in indiscriminate violence where they'll bullet rush people. It's sort of random and sort of terrorizing violence. I mean, actual assaults, beatings, indiscriminate use of chemical weapons and other munitions. And we've seen people harmed. I mean, it's actually surprising to me that no one has died because of the violence committed by police. And so that's what we've seen over the past 100 days. And for a brief moment, that was supplanted by federal law enforcement that came in and essentially did the exact same thing local law enforcement had been doing. And when the federal law enforcement left, we see local law enforcement, not only Portland Police Bureau, but Multnomah County Sheriff and Oregon State Police come in and engage in comparable violence. So it has been shocking. And I think at the end of the day, the only conclusion that I can make is that there's actually no civilian oversight or check on Portland Police Bureau. They are operating in a way that suggests that they don't expect to be suspended, terminated, reassigned. They're operating in a way in which it seems like they understand that there's no accountability on them.
so how do you reconcile that? A lot of the media, especially national media, is focused on, Trump talking about, chaos in Portland and lawlessness. How do you, reconcile that language with the fact that it sounds like, protesters there's a lot of crackdown and actually kind of the opposite is happening in terms of people's freedom of movement and expression?
Yeah, I mean, this is the narrative that we have to push back on and that we've been trying to push back on, and which is, why I appreciate the opportunity for being here and talking about this, is that we see law enforcement, not only Portland Police, but the Oregon Chiefs, the Oregon Sheriff's Association, and also other law enforcement agencies, and the right-wing media machine spin out this narrative of like lawlessness and chaos and, unchecked violence by protesters. And then we also, are hearing about the district attorney who decided to implement a reasonable policy about not validating these unconstitutional behaviors as if he's creating this lawlessness as well. And, we know this, like we understand that this is a strategy and a tactic, and it's part of the PR and sort of messaging that comes out from law enforcement, that they try to take a very small sliver of the population that are engaged in property crimes or, some sort of vandalism, and try to spin out of control that this is all of Portland, that this is all the protesters. And they keep using these labels as violence and violence and violence. When, as someone that works within the criminal justice system, what I find so interesting, sort of ironic, is that, on the back end of the criminal justice system, we have this violent, nonviolent divide between property offenders and, drug-related crimes and people who committed person crimes. On the front end of the system right now, what you're seeing is law enforcement, a concerted effort by the right-wing media machine and law enforcement talking about property crimes and vandalism as violence, and ignoring completely the indiscriminate violence. The only people really engaged in violence is law enforcement at this point. and they're the ones that are beating down and, using weapons against protesters. So, this is a distortion. I think this is the muddled message. This is our organization has been very vocal about the lack of leadership within the city. And I think the combination of all those has allowed this narrative to dominate. And, we're spending a lot of time and energy having to cut through that distortion and trying to actually present what is actually going on here.
Well, I appreciate you helping us present that. And Janelle, I'd like to turn back to you. We talked a lot about Portland, but we know that outside of Portland, we've seen some right-wing mobilization, most recently with armed militias detaining people at checkpoints in areas affected by wildfires. What have the police accountability movement in rural parts of Oregon looked like, and what have you seen happening among white supremacists in those areas?
It was a really interesting phenomenon. What I've had to unearth from my colleagues is that I think many of them thought that police accountability and police violence, so to speak, was happening only, or people were protesting about it only in Portland, that it wasn't necessarily a rural problem. And I had to push back on them and say, you should talk to the communities of color where you live and ask them about their experiences. And you will find that you have been living in bliss and that it's not all that great for them. So I think it's an education that has to happen over time. People have to see it for themselves. And unfortunately, because we keep having these events where we know people are being mistreated or they're being killed, Black and brown people are not leaving encounters with police alive. So sometimes it takes a repetition of the problem for them to see, for them to understand how bad it is for people in these remote communities as they interact with police. And it's just little small slights, like being stopped at a checkpoint. Like that seems harmless, but it's actually very very off-putting. It doesn't give you a sense of safety because you don't know. They're not telling you that they're protecting you. They're telling you that they're protecting themselves from you, and you don't even want anything from them. These checkpoints are a mess.
This is terrifying to me, just thinking about these interactions and what it'd be like to encounter these checkpoints and not knowing, either motives or how, I was going to survive that interaction. This question is for both of you, starting with Bob. And what do you think the Oregon state and local governments should be doing to systematically reform the police and root out officers connected to white supremacist groups?
I mean, I think that's where we're at is trying to figure out what can we do at this point. And, these are conditions I would say that have been created by a lack of leadership, at the city level, primarily. I think first and foremost, it's about articulating a clear value system, like what it is that we stand for, what it is that we are going to promote and protect. And I think that starts with saying, we believe in inclusive democracy. We believe in the right for people to live with dignity and free from fear from these far right elements and being harassed and targeted. I think also articulating very clearly like the same type of violence that some of our local leaders at the city level are saying that they stand against. So like they talk about Eric Garner or George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, but they won't actually name the individuals in our state that have been harmed by that same violence. Like they won't talk about like Keaton Otis or Quantas Hayes or Terrell Johnson, or Jason Washington or other people who've been harmed. So that disconnect from our local electeds by not recognizing that state violence that they're talking about in platitudes in these statements, they're not naming it here. So I think first and foremost, it's about having leadership that's very clear about what it is they stand for, the value system in which the community is out there, protesting and standing up and speaking out for, like, what is it that they're actually saying? And I think being responsive to that. But I think it's going to take a coordinated effort between city, county, and state to be able to do this. And I think what you're seeing at with the state level with the BIPOC caucus and Representative Bynum, they're leading that. They are actually aggressively trying to move what they can at the state level in a comprehensive and complete and holistic way. It's going to take that same type of energy and effort at the city and county level, and we're just not seeing that at the city level. In fact, I think at this point, the mayor is more of an impediment to change than he is to actually being able to help effectuate change. So first and foremost, I think we need to have leadership that's willing to actually be truthful and honest about this history, about the violence, about understanding the history of white supremacy and how that connects to today, and how that sort of infiltrates and percolates throughout our policing practices. Once we can be honest about the problem, then I think being able to think creatively about solutions becomes a lot easier. But if we don't even know the problem, if we're not even willing to be honest about the problem, we'll never, ever be able to get to real solutions.
Thanks, Bobbin. Representative Bynum, do you agree with that? Is there a lack of acknowledgement among local officials about the problem, and how do we change these structures?
I think people can't always put themselves in your shoes. They can't walk a mile in your shoes. And so they don't have a clear understanding of how bad or how delayed justice is for us, how deeply flawed the system is. So what I try to do is explain it in terms that maybe they can understand, like from the perspective of how my family lives. So we were just in a situation where we had to evacuate. We were right on the edge of the evacuation zone. And my husband and I looked at each other. We have 4 children, and we had a decision to make. Do we try to find somewhere in Oregon that we can take our 4 kids and bunker safely, or do we leave the state? And the reason we had to ask about whether we stayed in the state or out of the state is, where does a Black family go in Oregon and know that they can feel safe? Could we find that at a moment's notice? And could we get good treatment anywhere we went? And the answer for us became clear. While we didn't know where the smoke was going to go and the fires were going to go, and we didn't necessarily feel safe in every community, we chose to leave. And that, to me, is how I would characterize the difficulty for Black families, for brown families in the state. And until I can feel, I as a state lawmaker and my husband as a business owner, people who are raising children and checking all the right boxes, until I can feel safe anywhere in this state, the promise hasn't been delivered, and the work still needs to be done. So that's the perspective that I take, and that's the message that I keep giving. Until I can live freely in this state, the work is still undone.
All right, so I know you all have to run soon because you have a lot of work to do. Well, it's Friday afternoon, so hopefully you get some
There's
rest.
still work. We're still
probably
homeschooling.
I'll be working over the weekend. But for our community out there, what are the next steps? There's going to be a lot of institutional opposition to what you all are trying to do. How can folks get engaged? What are the next steps to get real transformation in these systems?
First, isn't today National Black Voting Day?
It is indeed.
So the first thing to do is to make a voting plan, because I think how people feel more engaged in the process is when they've actually voted on something. So that, to me, is the first step. And then the second step is when people start understanding what the process is in their city and what the process is in their county and the process is at the state for moving legislation. And the hardest part for me is trying to pass a bill, and I don't get public input no matter what I do. And so learning how to write letters, learning how to testify, but most importantly, casting that ballot so that when you call your mayor or your representative, you tell them, I voted and I vote consistently, and I will vote you out if you don't do your job. So that, to me, is what is so important and what is so necessary right now.
Thanks, Janelle. Bobbin, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's two parts to that, answering that question. I think first and foremost, what I've been, I think, saying often recently is the things that Brian Stevenson has been talking about. This idea that truth and reconciliation are sequential, that I think we really need to be truthful and honest about our history and white supremacy and the racial terror that's existed in this country and how that's manifested in these different structures and institutions, and what that's meant for communities of color in the United States. Like understanding that trauma, understanding how that's, expanded across multiple generations, and what has that meant for tribes, the Black community, other communities of color in our country, and being willing to just embrace that history and the complexity and the pain and acknowledging it. And then we can actually get to real sort of actions of reconciliation, because we'll never be able to fully realize like what those reconciliation efforts are unless we're really truthful. I think, the second part of that question is that I think we're at a point where people need to pick sides. Like the silent middle is no longer acceptable. We need to understand that we are either going to confront white supremacy and navigate ourselves through this conversation. This is what we're doing. We are pushing as advocates to confront this ideology, frustrate it and undermine it, and take it out of our institutions and deconstruct them and rebuild them, as Representative Bynum has alluded to. But I don't think there's no longer like a silent, you cannot be silent in this. Either you are for this effort, or your silence is being complicit in sustaining those efforts. So to elected officials, public officials, other community members, like I just don't think like we can be quiet or hope that there's some middle ground on this issue anymore. I think communities of color are speaking out. They're speaking out about their pain and experiences. And it's either we support that and we push forward with that knowledge, or we continue to try to ignore it and pretend it doesn't exist and continue down the same path of sustaining these structures and the pain of white supremacy. So I think those are the two things that I would say.
Well, thank you both so much. I appreciate you coming on the briefing and speaking your truth, helping us engage these issues, and thinking about how to really challenge these systems going forward in Oregon and in the rest of the country. So thank you. To our community out there, if you haven't already, please follow Appeal News on Facebook and The Appeal on Twitter for more updates and shows like this one. Have a great weekend. We'll be back with Emily on Monday as she discusses how COVID-19 has exacerbated the student debt crisis.